Good morning. Page 88. When Tukhachevsky was repressed, as they call it, not only was his immediate family broken up and imprisoned, it hardly needs to be said that his daughter was expelled from her institute, but his two brothers and their wives, his four sisters and their husbands were all arrested, while all his nephews and nieces were scattered about various orphanages, and their surnames changed to Tomashevich, Rostov, etc. His wife was shot in a camp in Kazakhstan. His mother begged for alms on the streets of Astrakhan and died there. Similar stories can be told about the relatives of hundreds of other eminent victims. This is a real persecution. That is a real persecution. The most important special feature of persecution, if you can call it that, in Tsarist times, was perhaps just this, that the revolutionary relatives never suffered in the least. Natalia Zdova, Trotsky's wife, returned to Russia without hindrance in 1907, when Trotsky was a condemned criminal, any member of the Ulyanov family, though nearly all of them were arrested at one time or another, could readily obtain permission to go abroad at any moment. When Lenin was on the wanted list for his exhortations to armed uprising, his sister Anna legally and regularly transferred money to his account with the Credit Lyonnais in Paris. Both Lenin's mother and Krupskaya's mother, long as they lived, received state pensions for their deceased husbands, one a high-ranking civil servant, the other an army officer, and it would have been unthinkable to make life hard for them. Such were the circumstances in which Tolstoy came to believe that only moral self-improvement was necessary, not political freedom. Of course, no one is in need of freedom if he already has it. We can agree with him that political freedom is not what matters in the end. The goal of human evolution is not freedom for the sake of freedom, nor is it the building of an ideal polity. What matter, of course, are the moral foundations of society. But that is in the long run. What about the beginning? What about the first step? Yasnya Polyana, in those days, was an open club for thinkers. But if it had been blockaded, as Akhmatova's apartment was, when every visitor was asked for his passport, if Tolstoy had been pressed as hard as all were in Stalin's time, when three men feared to come together under one roof, even he would have demanded political freedom. And the most dreadful moment of the Stolypin terror, the liberal newspaper Rus was allowed to report in bold type on its front page 5 executions, 20 executions at Kherson. Tolstoy broke down and wept, said that he couldn't go on living, that it was impossible to imagine anything more horrible. Then there's a previously mentioned list of Biolia, Biolia, 950 executions in 6 months. Let us take the issue of Biolia. Note that it appeared well within an 8-month period of Stolypin's military justice, August 1906 to April 1907, and that the list was compiled from data published by Russian news agencies. Much as though the Moscow papers in 1937 had given lists of those shot. which were then collated and republished, with the NKVD tamely turning a blind eye. Secondly, this 8-month period of martial justice, which had no precedent and was not repeated in Tsarist Russia, could not be prolonged because the impotent and docile State Duma would not ratify such measures. Indeed, Stolypin did not venture to submit them to the Duma for discussion. Thirdly, the events during the previous 6 months invoked in justification of military law included the murder of innumerable police officers for political motives, many attacks on officials, and the explosion on Aptekarsky Island. If it was argued, the state does not put a stop to these acts, then it will forfeit its right to exist. So, Stolypin's ministry, impatient and angry with the jury courts and their leisurely inconsequences, their powerful and uninhibited bar, not a bit like our oblast courts, provincial courts, or district tribunals obedient to a telephone call, snatched at a chance to curb the revolutionaries and also straightforward bandits who shot at the window of passenger trains and killed ordinary citizens for a few rubles by means of the laconic court-martial. Even so, there were few restrictions. The court-martial could be set up only in places in which martial law or a state of emergency had been declared. It convened only when the evidence of crimes was fresh, not more than 24 hours after the event, and when a crime had manifestly been committed. If contemporaries were stunned and shocked, it was obviously because this was something new to Russia. In the 1906-1907 situation, we see that the revolutionaries must take their share of blame for the Stolypin error, as well as the government. 100 years after the birth of revolutionary terror, we can say without hesitation that the terrorist idea and terrorist actions were a hideous mistake on the part of the revolutionaries and a disaster for Russia, bringing her nothing but confusion, grief, and inordinate human losses. Let us turn over a few more pages in the same number of Beloia. Here is one of the earliest proclamations dating from 1862, which were the start of it all. What is it that we want? The good, the happiness of Russia, achieving a new life, a better life, without casualties is impossible. But we cannot afford delay. We need speedy, immediate reform. What a false path. They, the zealots, could not afford to wait, and so they sanctioned human sacrifice of others, not themselves, to bring universal happiness nearer. They could not afford to wait, and so we, their great-grandsons, are not at the same point as they were when the peasants were freed, but much farther behind. Let us admit that the terrorists were worthy partners of Stolypin's court-martial. What, for us, makes comparison between the Stolypin and Stalin periods impossible is that in our time the barbarity was all on one side. Heads were cut off for a sigh, or for less than a sigh. Nothing more horrible, exclaimed Tolstoy. It is, however, very easy to imagine things more horrible. It is more horrible when the executions take place not from time to time and in one particular city of which everyone knows, but everywhere and every day, and not 20 but 200 at a time, with the newspapers saying nothing about it in big print or small, but instead saying that life has become better, life has become more cheerful. They bash your face in and say it was always ugly. No, things weren't the same, not at all the same. Although the Russian state even then was considered the most oppressive in Europe, the 20s and 30s of our century have deepened man's understanding of the possible degrees of compression. The terrestrial dust, the earth, which seemed to our ancestors as compact as may be, is now seen by scientists as a sieve full of holes, an isolated speck in 100 meters of emptiness. That is the model of the atom. They have discovered the nightmarish possibility of atom packing, forcing all the tiny nuclear specks from all those 100-meter vacuums together. A thimbleful of such packing weighs as much as a normal locomotive. But even this packing is too much like fluff. The protons prevent you from compressing the nuclei as tight as you could wish if you could compress neutrons. If you could compress neutrons alone, a postage stamp made of such neutron packing would weigh 5 million tons. And that is how tightly they squeezed us, without any help from pioneering physicists. Through Stalin's lips, our country was bidden henceforth to renounce complacency. But under the word used for complacency, Tao gives, quote, kindness of heart, a loving state of mind, charity, a concern for the general good, unquote. That was what we were called upon to renounce, and we did so in a hurry. Renounced all concerns for the general good. Henceforth, our own feeding trough was enough for us. Russian public opinion by the beginning of this century constituted a marvelous force, was creating a climate of freedom. The defeat of Tsarism came not when Kolchak was routed, but when the February Revolution was raging, but much earlier. Not when the February Revolution was raging, but much earlier. It was overthrown without hope of restoration once Russian literature adopted the convention that anyone who depicted a gendarme policeman with any hint of sympathy was a lickspittle and a reactionary thug. When you didn't have to shake a policeman's hand, cultivate his acquaintance, not to him on the street, but merely brush sleeves with him in passing to consider yourself a disgrace. Wow. Wow. Look at that. Look at that. Wow. Whereas we have butchers who, because they are now redundant and because their qualifications are right, are in charge of literature and culture. They order us to extol them as legendary heroes, and to do so is for some reason called patriotism. Public opinion, I don't know how sociologists define it, but it seems obvious to me that it can only consist of interacting individual opinions, freely expressed and independent of government or party opinion. So long as there is no independent public opinion in our country, there is no guarantee that the extermination of millions and millions for no good reason will not happen again and again, that it will not begin at any night, perhaps this very night. The vanguard doctrine, as we have seen, gave us no protection against this plague. Wow. This is, I don't know if you guys read like modern popular fiction, but I like to watch the girls, I like to watch them do reviews of their videos and stuff, or do reviews of the books they read. I don't prefer to read the books myself, but I find it fascinating what young women like to read, and this is exactly what they do. They're enforcing a morality on the books that are written right now. Like, you have to, to even, like, positively discuss, like, a cop, the personality of an officer or something like that, could be seen, or say an ICE agent, that would be seen as just, you're just showing yourself as on the evil side. If you even are writing a fiction book where you fictionalize, a positive character, ICE character, and not have somebody berate him as evil, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. It's exactly, I mean, there really is a lot of control over what is published, and it is based on ideology. It's fascinating to watch what these girls read, because they gotta promote the gay, lesbian, promote Marxist, all these ideas. They have to be positive about it, anti-capitalist, anti-wealth, anti-bourgeois values. It's just very fascinating to read that was going on back then. Sorry, but I can see my opponent pulling faces, winking at me, wagging his head. In the first place, the enemy may overhear me, and secondly, why such broad treatment of the subject? The question was posed much more narrowly. It was not why we were jailed, nor why did those who remained free tolerate this lawlessness. Everyone knows that they didn't realize what was going on, that they simply believed the party, that if whole peoples are banished in the space of 24 hours, those peoples must be guilty. The question is a different one. Why did we in the camps, where we did realize what was going on, suffer hunger, bend our backs, put up with it all instead of fighting back? The others, who had never marched under escort, who had the free use of their arms and legs, could be forgiven for not fighting. They couldn't, after all, sacrifice their families, their positions, their wages, their authors' fees. They're making up for it now by publishing critical reflections in which they reproach us for clinging to our rations instead of fighting when we had nothing to lose. But I've all along, in leading up to my answer to this, I've all along been leading up to my answer to this question. The reason why we put up with it all in the camps is that there was no public opinion outside. What conceivable way has a prisoner of resisting the regime to which he is subjected? Obviously, they are protest, hunger strike, escape, and mutiny. So then, it is obvious to anybody, as the great deceased like to say, and if it isn't, we'll ram it into him, that the first two have some force. That if the first two have some force, and if the jailers fear them, it is only because of public opinion. Without that behind us, we can protest and fast as much as we like, and they will laugh in our faces. That reminds me of a story about a Venezuelan farmer when they were confiscating property, and they took his family farm, so he went on a hunger strike, and he died because they're unmoved by anybody else's suffering. They just let him die, and it just reminds me of this. And it is a very dramatic way of obtaining your demands, standing before the prison authorities and tearing open your shirt, as Solzhenitsyn did, but only where public opinion exists. Without it, you'll be gagged by the tatters and pay for a government-issued shirt into the bargain. Let me remind you of a celebrated event which took place in the Kara hard labor prison at the end of the last century. Political prisoners were informed that in the future they would be liable to corporal punishment. Nadezhda Sigita was due to be thrashed first. She had slapped the commandant's face to force him to resign. She took poison and died rather than submit to the birch. 3 other women then poisoned themselves and also died. In the men's barracks, 14 prisoners volunteered to commit suicide, though not all of them succeeded. As a result, corporal punishment was abolished outright and forever. The prisoners had counted on frightening the prison authorities, for news of the tragedy at Kara would reach Russia and the whole world. But if we measure this case against our own experience, we shall shed only tears of scorn. Smack the commandant's face for an injury inflicted on someone else, and what is so terrible about a few thwacks across the backside? You'll go on living. And why did her women friends take poison too? And why 14 men besides? We are only given one life. We must make the best of it. As long as we get food and drink, why part with life? Besides, maybe there will be an amnesty. Maybe they'll start giving us food. Maybe they'll start giving us good conduct marks. You see from what a lofty plane prison behavior has declined, and how low we have fallen, and how, by the same token, our jailers have risen in the world. No, these are not the bumpkins of Kara. Even if we had plucked up our courage and risen above ourselves, 4 women and 14 men, we should all have been shot before we got to any prison, where, in any case, would it come from in a Soviet prison? If you did manage to poison yourself, you would only make the task of the authorities easier, and the rest would be treated to a dose of birch for not denouncing you. And needless to say, no word of the occurrence would ever leak through the boundary lines. This is the point. This is where their power lies. No news would leak out. If some muffled rumor did, with no confirmation from newspapers, the informers busily nosing it out. It would not get far enough to matter. There would be no outbursts of public indignation. So what is there to fear? So why should they lend an ear to our protests? If you want to poison yourselves, get on with it. The hopelessness of our hunger strikes has been sufficiently shown in part 1. Escape then? History has preserved for us accounts of some major escapes from Tsarist prisons. All of them left us note, or engineered and directed from outside by other revolutionaries, party comrades, and the escapers, with incidental help from many sympathizers. Many people were involved in the escape itself, in concealing the escapers afterward and slipping them across the frontier. Aha, my Marxist historians caught me out here. That was because the population sided with revolutionaries and because the future belonged to them. Perhaps also, I humbly replied, because it was all a jolly game and a legal one. Fluttering your handkerchief from a window, letting a runaway share your bedroom, helping him with his disguise. These were not indictable offenses. When Pyotr Lavrov ran away from his place of banishment, the governor of Vologda, Kominsky, gave his civil law wife permission to leave and catch up with her man. Even for forging passports, you could just be resuscitated. You could just be rusticated to your own farm, as we saw. People were not afraid. Do you know from your own experience what that means? While I think of it, how is it that you were never inside? Well, it was all a lottery. Investigated. There is, however, evidence of another kind. We were all made to read Gorky's Mother at school, and some of you may remember the account of conditions at the Nizhny Novgorod jail. The warders had rusty pistols with which they would knock the nails into the walls, and there was no difficulty at all in placing a ladder against the prison wall and calmly discharging yourself. The high police official Radigev writes as follows: banishment exists only on paper. Prison didn't exist at all. Prison conditions at that time were such that a revolutionary who landed in prison could continue his former activities without hindrance. The Kiev Revolutionary Committee were all in jail together, and while they directed a strike in the city and issued appeals. I have at present no access to information about security at the principal locations of the Tsar's Katorga, but if escape from there was ever as deliberately difficult as it was from Soviet counterparts, with one chance in 100,000 of success, I never heard it. There was obviously no reason for prisoners to take great risks. They were not threatened with premature death and death from exhaustion by hard labor, nor with extensions of sentence which they had done nothing to deserve. The second half of their term they served not in prison but in places of banishment, and they usually put off escapes till then. Laziness would seem to be the only reason for not escaping from Tsar's places of banishment. Evidently, exiles reported to the police infrequently. Surveillance was poor. There was no secret police posts along the roads. You were not tied to your workday in and day out by police supervision. You had money, or it could be sent to you, and places of banishment were not remote from the great rivers and roads. Again, no threat hung over anyone who helped a runaway, nor indeed was the runaway himself in danger of being shot by his pursuer, or savagely beaten, or sentenced to 25 years hard labor, as in our day. A recaptured prisoner was usually reinstalled in his previous place to complete his previous sentence, and that was all. You couldn't lose. Festenko's Departure Abroad, Part 1, Chapter 5, is typical of such ventures. But perhaps the anarchist A.P. Ivanovsky's escape from the Tarukan region is even more so. In the course of his escape, it was enough for him to look in at the student reading room and ask for Mikhailovsky's what is progress, and the student gave him a meal, a bed, and his fare. He escaped abroad by simply walking up to the gangway of a foreign ship, no MVD patrol there, of course, and finding a warm spot in the stokehold. More wonderful yet, during the 1914 war, he voluntarily returned to Russia and to his place of banishment in Tarukan. Obviously a foreign spy. Shoot him. Come on, you reptile. Tell us whose pay you're in. Well, no, for 3 years' absence abroad, the magistrate ordered him to pay a fine of 3 rubles and spend 1 day in the cell. 3 rubles was a lot of money, and Ulanovsky preferred 1 day in detention. Beginning with attempts to escape from Solovki by sea in some flimsy little boat, or in a hold among the timber, and ending with the insane, hopeless, suicidal breakouts from the camps in the late Stalin period, some later chapters devoted to them. Escape in our time has always been an enterprise for giants among men. for doomed giants. Such daring, such ingenuity, such willpower never went into pre-revolutionary escape attempts. Yet they were very often successful, and ours hardly ever. Because your attempts to escape were essentially reactionary in their class character. Can a man's urge to stop being a slave and an animal ever be reactionary? The reason for their failure was that success depends on the latter stages of the attempt, on the attitude of the population, and our population was afraid to help escapers, or even betrayed them, for mercenary or for ideological reasons. So much for public opinion. As for prison mutinies involving as many as 3, 5, 8,000 men, the history of our 3 revolutions knew nothing of them, yet we did. But the same curse was upon them, and very great efforts, very great sacrifices produced the most trivial results, because society was not ready, because without a response from public opinion, a mutiny, even in a huge camp, has no scope for development. So that when we are asked, why did you put up with it? It is time to answer, but we didn't. Read on and you will see that we didn't put up with it at all. In the special camps, we raised the banner of the politicals, and the politicals we became. What a great chapter. Thank you for listening. See you tomorrow.